For Workers' Chamber, Part 7. Lloyd George's Treasury Agreement was succeeded by the establishment of a National Labour Advisory Council, consisting of union representatives chaired by the Labour MP Arthur Henderson. This was to provide the government with advice on issues relating to labour. The Treasury Agreement became official law as the Missions of War Act passed in July 1915. As well as providing for the compulsory settlement of disputes, it also included a system of leaving certificates which an employee had to obtain from his employer before they could move to another job. It was intended to prevent employers from attempting to obtain scarce labour by competing with each other to offer higher wages. They were so unpopular with workers that the government was forced to abandon them in 1917. After his victory in the 1916 election, Lloyd George made Henderson one of the 5 ministers forming his war cabinet. He also established a Ministry of Labour, whose first minister was the trade union leader, John Hodge. He also set up a commission on labour unrest the following year in 1917. This was to investigate a series of strikes and disputes that had broken out from 1915 onwards. This was caused by the difference in wages between skilled and unskilled workers shrinking, as well as wages falling behind the rise in prices. Dissatisfaction with the moderate union leadership led to the emergence of a militant shop stewards movement. This resulted in workers on Clydeside setting up the Clydes Workers' Committee and a standing association of Pop Stewards, representing all the grades of worker. The association had links with the Independent Labour Party, which opposed the war, and so was considered subversive. It was the Commission's recommendation that the system of leaving certificates should be abandoned. The Commission also supported a proposal by a committee led by the Deputy Speaker of the House of Commons, J.H. Whitley, for a system of joint councils to be set up in each industry. These councils would include representatives of both the employers and the trade unions and would operate at every level, from national and local district down to the level of the local works. The system was abandoned in most industries during the Depression, as most employers believed that the threat of unemployment was sufficient to make workers content to accept their conditions without conflict. The system nevertheless survived in the civil service until it was terminated by the Conservatives in the 1990s. There are also demands for a much more authoritarian approach to solving the problem of a shortage of available labour for munitions work. The Army Council and the Conservatives, in addition to military conscription, also wanted industrial conscription to force workers into industries where their labour was needed. F.S. Oliver even talked about the need to beat that dog or organise labour to a jelly. Asquith passed the bill for military conscription in January 1916. Lloyd George was opposed to industrial conscription in favour of simply not allowing skilled workers to join up, and so the plans for industrial conscription were defeated. As well as setting up the Ministry of Labour, Lloyd George also established a series of other ministries, such as the Ministries for Food, Agriculture, Shipping, Information and an Air Board. With the exception of the Ministry of Labour, these were headed by leading industrialists, including Lord Northcliffe and Beaverbrook, who was Minister of Information. The government also used trade associations as government agencies. This broke with pre-war political attitudes which were strongly against businessmen occupying a political post, unless they had retired. While they brought their skills in the management of large enterprises to their posts, they also made politics much more conservative. They believed that after their appointments no further reforms were needed. It was an attitude that clashed with Lloyd George's own. The trend towards the greater inclusion of trade unions and businessmen in Parliament continued. Lloyd George described the new MPs who entered the House of Commons after the 1918 elections as the Trade Union Congress on the opposition benches and the Chamber of Commerce on the government side. In fact, 20 more trade unionists and 80 more businessmen had been elected than in the 1910 elections. From 1929 onwards, the British government also embarked on a policy of industrial diplomacy, abandoning laissez-faire on the operation of the free market in order to combat the effects of the Depression. This was a policy of negotiation and consultation between business and civil servants. This process was regarded as only temporary, and the policies adopted were those intended to allow industry to recover its ability to support itself rather than become permanently dependent on government support. Parliamentary politics was deliberately separated from industrial policy to prevent industry attempting to influence Parliament in its own favour. Thus, when the Import Duties Advisory Council was set up in 1932 to advise the government on the appropriate levels of tariffs, none of its staffs were civil servants. It was led by Sir George May, the author of a report that had recommended reducing state expenditure in the previous year in 1931. The government was thus concerned to avoid corporatism, and so was generally reluctant about developing the government machinery of committees to bring private industry under the control of the state. Legislation increasing self-government in private enterprise was only passed after industry had already given its consent to the proposals. Such legislation was in any case the exception to government policy, as most businessmen were opposed to official compulsion. Ramsay MacDonald's Labour government set up an Economic Advisory Council in 1930, which was intended to make a continuing study of development in trade and industry. This included studying the effects of fiscal policy and legislation. The council's members included economists, trade unions and businessmen, as well as the responsible ministers. The council was considered something of an experiment and only lasted in its original form up to 1932. A similar mixture of coercion and consultation returned to the government's management of industry during the Second World War. Ernest Bevin, the Minister of Labour, gained extensive powers of control under Defence Regulation 58A, one of the provisions of the Emergency Powers Defence Act of 1940. On industrial relations, Bevin was advised by the Joint Consultative Committee, which included representatives from the TUC and the British Employers' Federation. It was on their advice that Bevin issued the Conditions of Employment and National Arbitration Order number 1305 in July 1940. Strikes and lockouts were banned, with disputes over wages settled compulsorily by a national arbitration tribunal. Some strike action and lockouts were nevertheless permissible if the minister decided not to refer their case to the tribunal. By the end of the war, the tribunal had issued 816 judgments. This did not prevent strikes breaking out, and there were more in the Second World War than in the First. Strikes were settled more quickly, so that the number of working days lost was less than half of that of the First World War. The government also found it difficult to punish large numbers of strikers. When the miners at Betshanger in Kent went on strike, the government was unable to collect the fines imposed on over 1,000 of them. It was also forced to give in to demands to release the strike's leaders from prison in order to get them to return to work. Under the provisions of the Restriction on Engagement Order of 1940, businesses could only recruit workers through a labour exchange or an approved trade union. In March of the next year, in 1941, the Essential Works Order number 301, General Provisions, was passed. Like the leaving certificates of the First World War, this was intended to prevent staff leaving vital industries. Under its provisions, it was forbidden for workers to leave or be dismissed from any factory or enterprise scheduled by the Ministry of Labour without the minister's consent. This was not resented as much as the leaving certificates of the First World War, as Bevin was concerned that the workers affected by the legislation should be properly paid and enjoy adequate working conditions and standards of welfare, and so these were controlled by the government. Labour conscription was also introduced, most notably in the case of the 22,000 Bevin boys, who were recruited to work in the mines. In most cases, the government did not directly command workers to enter specific industries. Instead, workers were indirectly forced into particular industries through government reductions of alternative forms of employment. This was achieved either through concentration schemes or through the control of investments and the supply of raw material. The government was also keen to maximise production through maintaining good industrial relations. In 1941, a Ministry of Production was set up along with a series of regional boards of industry. In 1942, this was followed by a National Production Advisory Council. These also included representatives from the trade unions, who were also representative on the joint production committees, further down the bureaucratic hierarchy. By 1945, these represented 3.5 million workers. The government's policy in general was to leave wages to be negotiated freely between workers and employers. There were cases where the wages were so low that the government was forced to intervene. In 1940, the government set up the Central Agricultural Wages Board to set wages for male farm workers, and the Catering Wages Act of 1943 also set up a Catering Wages Commission for the workers in that sector. In 1945, the trades boards were converted into wages boards and their powers extended. Labour controls were gradually repealed after the end of the war. Strikes were still officially banned until 1951, but the policy was unenforceable. In 1947, the government gained the consent of the trade union leaders to renew the wartime powers for directing labour, though this was limited to exceptional cases. This only affected a very small number of workers, and the legislation was allowed to lapse in 1950. The essential work orders also remained in force for workers in mining and agriculture until that year. The government returned to a corporative approach in managing industrial relations in 1957. In the early 1950s, R.A.B. Butler, as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, had tried unsuccessfully to negotiate with the TUC to tie wage increases to productivity. The engineering and docks companies attempted to negotiate with the unions for voluntary wage restraints in those industries in 1957, but also with no success. The government that same year established the Council on Productivity, Wages and Incomes, which was intended to provide it with advice on wage claims. The TUC was hostile to the new council and refused to cooperate with it until it was finally abolished 5 years later in 1962. By the 1960s, the Conservatives as well as Labour also turned to embracing economic planning following the success of the French and using it to promote growth in a capitalist economy through the Commissariat du Plan. This time the pressure came from the employers' organisation, the Federation of British Industries, and received the strong support of the Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. The government therefore set up the National Economic Development Council, NEDC, in 1961. This was intended to bring together representatives of the TUC, the employers' organisations and government ministers, who would then work together to identify and remove obstacles to investment and increase productivity. The French Commissariat had greater powers than its British imitator to direct the flow of credit and direct the large sector of the French economy owned by the state. Unlike the NEDC, the Commissariat was also prepared to interfere directly in industry. In Britain, it had been assumed that each industry should be left to solve its own problems during the operation of an Economic Development Council, which limited the government's ability to interfere in particular parts of the economy or industries. The government also introduced at the same time a National Incomes Commission. From the start, the NEDC suffered from 4 problems affecting its ability to plan the economy effectively. To begin with, technology and markets were continually changing, which made it difficult to identify in detail the changes that were needed. The unions were also hostile to the separate existence of the National Incomes Commission, with the result that the planning process necessarily included questions of wage increases as well as increases in productivity. The TUC wished productivity to be raised as high as possible in order to justify large wage increases. The state of the economy at the time meant that this could not be achieved without causing problems in the balance of payments. While the government was able to raise demand, it lacked the power to make the necessary changes in industry to increase production directly. On their part, the TUC and the employers' organisations could do no more than give their members advice. There was also the problem that reducing risk was not the best way to encourage industrial expansion, as increased demand would lead to an increase in profits without the implementation of radical changes. Nevertheless, the employers and the unions agreed a declaration of intent on productivity, prices and incomes in 1964. The next year, in 1965, the government set up a national board for prices and incomes under George Brown as the Minister for Economic Affairs, and experimented with both voluntary and involuntary pay freezes. It was considered the board would stand a better chance of success than its predecessor, the National Incomes Commission, as unlike the Commission, it depended on being accepted on both sides. The board was intended to make industrial relations more peaceful so that managers would be able to predict how their businesses would develop over the next 5 years. These predictions would then be collected, analysed and formed into a coherent whole by economists, who would then devise an appropriate plan. The employers would benefit by having the information available on the expected increases in other parts of the economy, and so would themselves be able to plan for higher growth. The Prices and Incomes Board was also able to make useful recommendations for improving production and service by giving a very wide interpretation to its aim of investigating price levels. For instance, it examined the management of advertising campaigns by the detergent companies, how architects set their fees, and the way banks treated their customers. It was also believed that the board would follow the example of the Swedish Central Authority, making its suggestions for pay increases binding. The law stipulated that the company had to give a month's advice before granting a pay increase. During this period, the government could consider referring the case to the board, which would decide on the basis of a productivity agreement whether the wage increase was justified. Thank you. That's the end of the 7th part of this reading. Thank you for listening.